Good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to go over the assignment that you worked on yesterday, the 10 amendments thing. And today we're going to talk about some state and local constitution stuff. I only have a couple questions for you to do with it. Tomorrow, I'm sure you're aware, is a teacher in service day, so I won't see you. But next week, looking forward, this is the last thing that we have to do for the Constitution. So I would like to do a really short, very simple, like 10-question multiple choice, very basic quiz on the Constitution. I'm going to do that. I'm planning on doing that next Tuesday because it wouldn't quite feel fair to have you do that next Monday since I haven't seen you. And since there's a long weekend, you're going to forget everything between now and then. So next Tuesday, I'm thinking of a 10-question quiz. By basic, I mean, it's going to ask things like, pick the definition of a constitution. How many amendments are in the Bill of Rights? Which article do you find the legislative branch? Which article is the executive? Which article is the judicial? Very, very softball, easy stuff. At least I'm hoping it'll be. So just a heads up about that. That's in the near future. So let's go over this quick first, the Bill of Rights. You had a lot of time to work on this yesterday, so I'm sure that most of you got it done. I looked through some of the ones that were submitted. So here are the answers that I have. Number one, Samantha is accused of selling drugs. When she appears before the judge, she asks for a lawyer because she can't afford one herself, and the judge denies her access to a lawyer. This is Article 6. Article 6 specifies that every person, if they can't get a lawyer for themselves, then the state will appoint them one. That's a pretty key concept in the Bill of Rights. Even if you can't afford a lawyer, it's to try to make the playing field kind of equal. Even if you're poor, you'll be represented fairly. That's the idea, at least. Question 2, Maya went on a job interview and mentioned that she belonged to the Church of Everyday Salvation. She had not get the job because the interviewer didn't like this church. That's the First Amendment right here. First Amendment has 5 things in it. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and freedom to petition. So that would be the freedom of religion aspect there. Number 3, Liz is accused of murder and given a trial. The jury finds her innocent. The prosecutor is unhappy with the verdict, has the police arrest her and recharge her with murder. So in violation there of the Fifth Amendment, let's see if, excuse me. Fifth Amendment specifies no person can be subject to being tried for the same offense twice. So it's called double jeopardy. Doesn't have anything to do with the game show, but you can't be tried for the same thing twice unless new evidence comes up or something like that. But you can't be tried for the same thing twice in a row. That's to try to prevent people from getting harassed all the time. If they've already been found innocent, then unless something totally new changes the case altogether, then it's not fair to keep trying the person over and over again. Number 4, Chris lives near a factory that emits thick black smoke into the air. He holds a meeting at his house to discuss action, and the police show up and arrest him. That's the First Amendment right there. They are assembling, and people have the right to peaceably assemble. They're meeting in his house. They're not doing anything wrong. They're just talking about it. So the police coming in and breaking it up, that would be a violation of the First Amendment. Ray bought and registered a shotgun to hunt near his farm in rural Arkansas, but when visiting Ray, the local sheriff arrested him for possessing the gun. This is a pretty easy one. This is the Second Amendment. A lot of people around here are familiar with that one. Has to do with the owning and maintenance of firearms. Where are we at? Number 6. Charlie is watching a Real Housewives episode one night when the police knock at his door. They accuse him of owning stolen property and force their way into his house. So they force their way into his house. This violates the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, specifically in this case, against unreasonable searches and seizures. So the police can't just show up, kick down your door, and start taking stuff. They need to have a warrant. And to get a warrant, you have to go to a judge and prove that it's likely that there is some evidence there. You also have to prove to the judge what evidence you're going to get. Number 7, Matt is accused of robbing a 7-Eleven. I think it says Sheets on yours. Of robbing Sheets. When he appears before the judge says he will decide the case for himself. He doesn't need a jury. This is a violation of the 6th Amendment. Right here in the first part, I believe it is. In all criminal prosecutions, not only does the person who's accused deserve a speedy and public trial, there also has to be an impartial jury. So the judge can't just up and decide on his own, whether or not this person has done it. There needs to be a jury present. And they have to be a jury of his peers, an impartial jury. Number 8, Christine is arrested for shoplifting. Christine is arrested for shoplifting a pair of jeans from Forever 21. When she is arraigned, the judge sets bail at $3 million. That's pretty absurd for a pair of jeans, and so it's in violation of the 8th Amendment, which says pretty plainly, excessive bail shall not be required. That's pretty excessive in my book, $3 million just for a pair of jeans. So violation of the 8th Amendment. Number 9, Fort Meade is overflowing with military soldiers, and the government orders each family in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, to feed and house 2 soldiers. This is a violation of the 3rd Amendment, which says that soldiers cannot be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. So the government can't just show up and say, hey, these soldiers live in your house now. They're going to take your stuff. This one has never actually come up since it was written. We haven't had any Supreme Court cases that deal with it. But at the time, this was kind of a big deal. Because the British had been doing this for a little while and the people were not happy about it. But we haven't really had any, there have been no Supreme Court cases that reference the 3rd Amendment, but this scenario would be a violation of it. The last one, number 10, James got in a fight after school yesterday and punched another student. He was arrested and convicted at trial. Instead of jail time, his punishment would be a caning of 100 lashes in the auditorium while the entire school watches. That is a pretty clear violation of the 8th Amendment. 8th Amendment has to do with bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. Not only would that be a super cruel punishment, after 100 hits on the back from a cane, you probably wouldn't live. That would be pretty unusual. By anyone's definition, that would be a really strange way to punish a student. So that would be the violation of the 8th Amendment there. You'll notice that neither of these have anything to do with the 9th or 10th Amendment. That's because the 9th Amendment has to do with where rights belong. So the 9th Amendment says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed or to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So it's basically saying that if the Constitution doesn't say anything about it, meaning if the Constitution didn't name this certain right, it belongs to the people just because we didn't name it here. And Amendment 10 says that powers that are not given to the federal government by the Constitution belong to the states. Or to the people, I guess it says at the end too. But generally that's referring to any powers that aren't specifically given to the federal government, they belong to the states. The last question, are your rights absolute or do you have them at all times? The sample answer here says that this could go a lot of different ways, and I guess it's kind of right. What it boils down to for me, usually how I think of it, is that your rights extend until they infringe on someone else's rights. So up until your rights have, your expression of your rights has violated someone else's rights, you do have access to those rights. Now, of course, you're in a school system, but you don't have access to all of your rights while you're in the school building. And the Supreme Court has agreed that in some situations and in some cases, such as in school, it's perfectly acceptable to limit certain rights. Even if you're taking care of your gun really well, you can't carry it into school. So even if you are following the letter of the Second Amendment there, the Supreme Court has agreed that it's perfectly acceptable to limit that freedom in a school setting. So you don't have all of your rights all of the time in every situation. They are limited in certain circumstances. So that is the Bill of Rights. I won't ask you to spit any of those back at me word for word or anything like that. And we'll talk about those in great detail when we get to the Supreme Court section a ways down the road when we talk about the judiciary. We'll talk about Supreme Court cases, but it's good for you to have an idea of your rights and what things are contained in those first 10 amendments. So let's real quick go over, scroll up to the top here. Some stuff about state constitutions. So each state has a constitution. Everyone lives under the US Constitution in the US, of course, but all states have a constitution or a local charter as well. And I include this because it's kind of unique and interesting. On reservations or in other lands that are owned and what's the word I'm thinking of? Governed by Native Americans or Alaskan Natives, they also have their own unique legal framework set in place. But at any given time, you have at least 3 governments over top of you. You have the federal government, of course, the US government, you have the state government, and you have some sort of local government. Each state has its own constitution. So we're going to glance through that quick. The first state constitutions, they come from charters. A charter was a thing that was written by the king as a kind of legal framework for how the colony is going to work. It included some of the basic principles that are included today, things like power belongs to the people, the government can't do whatever it wants, that kind of thing. However, it centered most of the power around the legislature, the lawmaking body. None of them were cool with full religious freedom. Each state had very strict, some more strict than others, but many states, because they were settled primarily by Puritans or Catholics, they were originally pretty strict with what religions were allowed to be practiced in their states. They also had really strict qualifications for voting, and all of them favored property owners. If you didn't own property, you weren't worth much in the colonies, politically speaking. So they had pretty strict qualifications, but today they have changed quite a bit. That's just kind of the historical basis of it. Today, the modern constitutions, they have a lot in common with the US Constitution. Just like the US Constitution has the 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, the state constitutions establish that as well. So each state has its own legislature, executive, and judicial branch. They also include some of the same basic principles, like the government can't do whatever it wants, there will be elections, people are generally equal, those kinds of principles. State legislatures, this is speaking pretty broadly because each state's a little bit different, but in almost every state, there are 2 houses to their legislature, usually a Senate and a House of Representatives or something similar to it. So it's called bicameral, like bicycle. There are two sections to it. It's kind of difficult to balance how many should be, how many people should be in these bodies, because the ideal size, you don't want it to be too many people, because that'll make it really difficult to agree on anything. If you have 700 people in a room, it's going to be really hard to get half of them to agree on something. But you also don't want to block anyone's voice out. In a big state like Pennsylvania, or an even bigger state like Texas or California, you want to make sure that everyone's heard and everyone has a representative, but you don't want 700 people shouting at each other the whole time, because nothing's going to get done. So you have to kind of strike a balance between there. State constitutions, they define things like who can vote, they define things like who can be voted in to office. So how long you've had to live in the state, how old you have to be, those kinds of things. Legislators, they're chosen by elections. They usually serve between 2 or 4 terms, just like at the federal level, we have 2, 4, and 6-year term limits or terms. And the state legislatures have the ability to pass any law as long as it doesn't conflict with federal law, because that's above it, or the state constitution. That might seem like it's pretty narrow what the state legislatures are able to do, but it actually provides a lot of different powers. It gives them the powers to do taxes at the state level. They can spend, borrow that money. They can establish courts. They can define crimes and punishments. They can regulate commerce. One of their biggest ones is maintaining the public schools, where you are currently, hooray, and other powers that are given to them through the Constitution. The governors, this is the executive branch. Typically, this is pretty common among all the constitutions, but they're not all exactly the same. Typically, they have to be American citizens. They have to be between 25 or 30 years of age at minimum, and they have to have lived in that state for at least 5 years. That's a pretty basic requirement. They're all elected by popular vote. Most of them have 4-year terms, so they're elected to office. They're there for 4 years, and they can't serve more than 2 terms. So 8 years total, can't go beyond that. Almost all of them have a role called a lieutenant governor, which is like a vice president. It's the second person in line who could serve in their absence. So if something happens to the governor, lieutenant governor takes over. And just like the president or any other federal official, the governor can be removed from office by impeachment or by being convicted in a trial. The impeachment is the trial process, and then punishment is handed out if they're found guilty as part of that impeachment. The governor's duties and powers vary, but most of them have the ability to appoint and remove state officials. They also supervise the state's executive branch, so the people who work in the offices. They're usually the ones who set up the budget and take it to the legislature and see if the legislature approves it. So they're more involved in that process. And just like at the national level, the president is in charge of the military. The governor is in charge of the state militia, or as is known today, is the National Guard. So again, we have a civilian, usually a civilian in charge of a military group, which is a common principle in US government. We have the state courts. We have 3 levels to state courts in each state. At the lowest level, we have general trial courts. That's for your everyday civil and criminal cases. You commit a crime, you're going to the trial court. You're trying to take someone to court, regular civil case, you're going to a trial court. Above it, we have what's called appellate courts. These are courts of appeal. You can see the word appeal and the word appellate. They look pretty similar. If you don't like the outcome of your court case in the general trial courts, and you can prove that either things went wrong or new evidence has come to light, or something illegal happened in the process, then you can go to an appellate court and point this out, and the appellate court might pick up the case. Lastly, at the top of this pyramid of power, we have the state Supreme Courts, and they can review the decisions of the lower court. So we basically have 3 different layers of people checking each other's homework and make sure everything has gone smoothly. Just like at the federal level, the state Supreme Court picks which cases it wants and doesn't want. So they can weigh in on what's important or what isn't important at a given time. But they're only one court, so they can't take care of everything. So that's why they accept some and don't accept other cases. Generally, the state court judges are selected by either popular vote, by the governor appointing them, or the legislature appointing them. In PA, it's popular vote. Constitutions can change. Just like at the federal level, we have amendments. At the state level, we also have amendments. State constitutions oftentimes have a lot more amendments than the US Constitution. Remember, the US Constitution is pretty short, just lays out how the government's going to work. It's a baseline. Everyone has to follow it everywhere in the US. The state constitution then has the freedom to go a little bit further. While everyone is following the US Constitution, the state constitution can focus on how things are really going to run. The US Constitution sets out, how elections are going to work, who can run for office, those kinds of things. But it doesn't really say what laws are allowed and what laws are, it doesn't weigh in on those more nitty-gritty day-to-day topics. So the state governments usually do that. Alabama currently has the longest list of amendments. They have 770 of them. So you can imagine it's a pretty lengthy book. PA, we've got 33. We're on the shorter end, but the average is 115 of them. So you can imagine state constitutions are a little bit lengthier than the US Constitution. Just like with the US Constitution, though, the amendment serves the same purpose. It can change the document in any way. So it can change the structure of the government. It can redefine the powers. It can expand rights or restrict rights. It can do any of those things. To propose a constitution, you kind of have 3 options here in a state. You can propose it by a convention. You can propose it by legislature. So people who are elected, they can propose an amendment, or it can be proposed by initiative, meaning a petition. So a number of people can sign on to a petition, and it can be added to a ballot that people will vote on. I have 2 videos here that I'd like you to watch on your own. They're both really short. They're both like 1.5 minutes long. And then I have just a couple questions for you here, asking about state legislators, state governors, state courts, and 2 review questions. So you have the rest of the period to respond to those. And I will see you next week. Don't forget that we'll have a really short, very simple quiz next Tuesday, or at least that's the plan. All right. have a lovely weekend, and I will see you next week.